Emily Carter was born in a small town in western Kentucky where the sidewalks cracked and the porches creaked, where people waved from their pickup trucks but rarely asked what lay beneath your smile. She was the second child of David and Helen Carter, the middle-class couple who lived on Elm Street in the faded blue house with the peeling shutters. Her older brother, Josh, was the golden boy, strong, loud, confident, the son who could do no wrong. Emily, on the other hand, learned very early that silence was safer than speaking. Her childhood was not abusive in the way that made headlines. No bruits, no broken bones. Just absence, of attention, of affection, of acknowledgement. The kind of neglect that doesn't show up in photographs, but festers quietly in the corners of a child's mind. Her father was a former Marine who ran a hardware store downtown and believed in discipline over discussion. He called emotion a weakness and books a waste of time unless they taught you how to build something. Her mother, Helen, stayed at home, occupied with chores, church groups, and the daily effort of upholding an image of a perfect Christian family. She cooked and cleaned, but rarely listened. Emily's earliest memory of feeling invisible was at age 6, when she brought home a drawing of the house with her family smiling under a bright yellow sun. Her teacher had written, "So much love here," in red ink. She remembered handing it to her mother in the kitchen, who glanced at it briefly before saying, "Put it on the fridge if you want. Dîner est almost ready." Josh had walked in moments later, shouting that he scored 2 goals at recess. Their mother had clapped, hugged him, and called him her little hero. That was the moment Emily understood. Praise was reserved for loudness, for action, for boys who took up space. Girls like her, quiet and unsure, were supposed to stay out of the way. Through elementary and middle school, Emily excelled academically. She read everything she could get her hands on, novels, poetry, even medical journals she didn't fully understand. She wrote stories in spiral notebooks she kept hidden under her mattress, afraid someone might laugh if they knew she had dreams. She had no close friends, not because she was unfriendly, but because she never believed anyone would truly want to know her. At school, teachers admired her writing, but never asked why her essays often explored loneliness, abandonment, and imaginary worlds where girls with quiet voices changed everything. At home, her accomplishments were met with muted nods or distracted shrugs. When Josh made the football team, there was a cookout in the backyard. When Emily won the statewide writing contest in 8th grade, her mother told her, "That's nice, dear," without looking up from folding laundry. One particular afternoon when she was 14, Emily came home to find Josh and their father in a heated argument. Josh had skipped school, gotten into a fight, and damaged the family truck. David's face was red with fury, but when he turned and saw Emily in the doorway, he stopped yelling. "Take your brother's backpack up to his room," he barked. Emily obeyed. Later that night, she overheard her parents whispering behind their bedroom door. "We can't let this ruin his future, Helen," David said. "What do you suggest?" "We say it was Emily who took the truck. She's always in the background anyway. It won't affect her like it would him. He's got a shot at a football scholarship." Emily sat on the hallway floor, the cold wood pressing against her spine. She didn't cry. Not then. Not even the next day, when her parents asked her to sign a statement saying she had taken the truck without permission. She did it. Silently. Obediently. Afterward, she stopped talking at dinner. She no longer showed her mother drawings or essays. She never brought friends home. At school, she smiled when spoken to, laughed when expected, and disappeared into the background with remarkable efficiency. By the time high school started, Emily had perfected the art of invisibility. She wore neutral colors, sat at the back of the classroom, and spoke only when called upon. The teachers liked her, but few remembered her after graduation. She was the girl who turned in every assignment early, the one who cleaned up after group projects without being asked, the one who never caused trouble. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewed. Her journals filled with words she never said aloud, questions about why some children were loved more than others, why parents seemed incapable of seeing pain unless it was loud, angry, and impossible to ignore. She wrote about running away, about leaving Kentucky and never returning, about becoming someone new in a city where no one knew her silence, only her words. She applied to the University of Illinois at Chicago in secret. She chose it because it was far enough to require a one-way bus ticket, but affordable enough with financial aid. She was accepted with a partial scholarship and plans to work 2 part-time jobs. When she told her parents, her father scoffed. "Chicago? That city's full of crime and liberals, he muttered. Her mother said, why go so far just to study English? That won't get you anywhere.
Josh loget outright.
You?
Live on your own?
You'll be back in a month. Emily packed quietly. The night before she left, no one helped her load the car. Her mother reminded her to be careful, not out of warmth, but obligation. Her father didn't say goodbye. Josh didn't come downstairs. But before she closed the front door for what she thought might be the last time, she turned back and whispered into the empty hallway.
Iwasir.
Even if none of you ever really saw me. She stepped into the humid Kentucky night and took the first breath of freedom she'd ever tasted, not sweet, but real. And that was enough. For now. Chicago was colder than Emily had expected. Not just in temperature, but in temperament. The city moved fast, spoke loud, and didn't pause to make room for newcomers who didn't know how to belong. She arrived with a single suitcase, a half-used bus pass, and the quiet conviction that disappearing in a crowd might be better than being invisible in a family. The university campus was sprawling, modern, alive. Students rushed past her with earbuds in and coffees in hand. It was the kind of place she had imagined in her journals, diverse, anonymous, full of possibilities. She was 18, and for the first time in her life, entirely untethered. She moved into a dormitory on the south end of campus, sharing a room with a business major named Stephanie who had an expensive phone, a loud laugh, and no understanding of personal boundaries. Stephanie had grown up in the suburbs of Milwaukee, wore bright makeup to class, and regularly video chatted with her parents about her grades, her lunch, her laundry. Emily watched her from across the room, fascinated and vaguely envious. It was like observing a species she had only read about. Emily quickly learned how to navigate life in the city. She got a part-time job at a corner bakery a few blocks from campus, working early morning shifts before her 9 a.m. lectures. On weekends, she shelved books at the campus library, a job she applied for because it came with solitude and proximity to her favorite smell, old pages and wood polish. Despite the exhaustion, she liked it. The movement, the schedules, the predictability. It gave her purpose. Structure. Something to hold on to when the silence of her room at night echoed too loudly. She rarely called home. The few times she did, her mother asked about grades and reminded her to stay away from dangerous neighborhoods. Her father never got on the line. Josh, she assumed, was back home, basking in whatever glow their parents reserved only for him. In Chicago, Emily was just another student. No one knew about her quiet upbringing, the truck incident, or the weight of years spent trying to be seen. She wore black sweaters, took meticulous notes, and sat near the window in every class. Her professors noticed her intelligence but not her presence. That was exactly how she liked it, until the fracture came. It started on a Friday in November. She had been awake since 5 a.m., working a double shift at the bakery to cover her growing textbook expenses. It had snowed the night before, and her shoes were soaked through before she made it to class. She hadn't eaten since the night before and had 3 assignments due before midnight. By the time she walked into her literature and society seminar, her hands were shaking from fatigue. She took her usual seat by the window, opened her notebook, and tried to focus. But the words blurred, and her head began to throb. Halfway through the discussion on Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, the professor called on her. Emily, what do you think Baldwin meant when he talked about love as a means of survival? She blinked. The room spun slightly. She began, then stopped. Her throat closed. Sweat gathered on the back of her neck. I'm sorry, she mumbled.
Il need un moment.
She stood up to leave but stumbled, knocking her notebook off the desk. As she bent down, the lights above seemed too bright, too loud. Her vision went white at the edges. Then black. When she came to, she was lying on the floor, her professor kneeling beside her, and a small crowd of students standing nearby. Someone had called campus emergency services. Her blood sugar had crashed. Severe dehydration.
Mild hypothermia.
She spent the night in the campus clinic, hooked to N4. A nurse with soft eyes and a warm accent told her gently, "You have to take care of yourself, sweetheart.
You don't get extra crédit for fallin à part."
Emily laughed, then cried. Not loud sobs, but silent tears that slipped down her cheeks and soaked into her pillow. She hadn't cried since the night she overheard her parents plan to sacrifice her future for Josh's. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't grief. It was grief's quieter cousin, grief that had grown into exhaustion. After being discharged, she walked home slowly, boots crunching in the fresh snow. She passed a row of townhouses with glowing windows. Inside, families were laughing, passing dishes around tables, preparing for Thanksgiving. She realized, with a dull ache, that it was almost the holiday break. Her classmates would be going home to turkey and warmth and the comfort of being wanted. She had no plans to go back. Later that night, Emily sat at her desk in the dorm and opened her journal. She hadn't written in weeks. The pages felt foreign beneath her fingers. But once she started, the words poured out like they had been waiting for release. I passed out in class today, she wrote. Because I haven't eaten properly in 2 days. Because I thought working 3 shifts was more important than sleeping. Because I thought if I could just keep everything together, maybe I wouldn't fall apart. But I did. And no one from home will ever know. They won't ask. They won't care. She paused. Then added. And I don't think I want them to. It was the first time she had acknowledged that her desire for their attention had started to fade. Not because she didn't care, but because she was learning to survive without it. The following week, she took a few days off work and allowed herself to rest. Stephanie noticed and surprised her with a cup of hot chocolate and a pack of sticky notes that said, "You matter more than your grades." It was a small gesture, but it cracked something open in Emily. She began to accept that maybe not all people disappointed you. Maybe some would show up, not as saviors, but as reminders that not everyone disappears when you need them. She started returning to the library even when she wasn't scheduled. She began reading poetry aloud when no one was around. She began to imagine a version of herself who didn't flinch at kindness, who didn't apologize for needing help. It would take years to become that version. But something had shifted. She had broken, yes, but sometimes, fractures let in light. And Emily, for the first time, had begun to see herself. Thanksgiving came and went in Chicago like a slow breath against a frost-covered window. Campus emptied out, dorm rooms grew quiet, and for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to be still. She spent the break alone, wrapped in her thrifted fleece blanket, reading Toni Morrison and making instant oatmeal over a portable kettle. It wasn't much, but it was hers. No passive-aggressive silences. No Josh monopolizing attention. No eyes measuring her worth in chores completed or grades received.
Juste silence, the goûtquin.
In early December, she received a letter from home. Not an email, not a text, but an actual letter. Her mother's handwriting, precise and angular, spilled across the page in blue ink. Emily. Hope school is going well. We missed you at Thanksgiving. Josh brought his girlfriend over. She asked about you. I told her you were too busy with college. Your dad says hello.
Love.
Mom.
Nos questions. Nos réels warmth.
Just a summary, a note, as if they were distant acquaintances. Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She didn't respond. Finals came and went. Her grades were solid, 2 A's and 2 B's. She didn't celebrate. There was no one to celebrate with. But inside, a quiet pride took root. Not the kind that sought applause, but the kind that knew the weight of its own endurance. The holidays approached. Most students returned home to their families. Emily stayed behind and picked up extra shifts at the bakery. Christmas morning, she worked a double. Her manager, a single father named Ray, gave her a mug of peppermint coffee and said, "You saved my ass today, Carter. My daughter would have killed me if I missed Christmas brunch." That night, she walked home past decorated storefronts and carolers in coats too clean to be real. The city twinkled with other people's joy. Emily didn't resent it. She just didn't know what it felt like. By January, the cold had deepened. Her boots leaked at the toes, and her gloves were mismatched, but she had learned to layer efficiently. She knew which campus buildings stayed warm the longest and where to sit in the library to catch the last ray of sunlight. One afternoon, after a long shift shelving books, Emily was cleaning up a spill in the humanities section when someone cleared their throat behind her. "You missed a spot." She looked up, startled. A guy with messy curls and round glasses pointed at a coffee ring on the shelf. "Thanks," she said, a little defensive. "Didn't mean to offend." "Just, books deserve better," he replied, grinning. He introduced himself as Marcus. A senior majoring in sociology, he'd been working in the library part-time for 2 years but mostly on evenings. This was his first daytime shift in a while. Over the next few weeks, Emily found herself running into Marcus more often. They shared shifts, exchanged favorite authors, and occasionally debated over which Baldwin essay was the most essential. He was sharp, observant, and had the rare ability to be intense without being overwhelming. One evening, after a closing shift, they walked home together through the snow-dusted campus. Marcus stopped at the corner before their paths split and asked, "Do you ever write anything yourself? Or just read other people's brilliance?" Emily hesitated, then nodded.
You êtes tout right.
Mostly when I couldn't talk.
Why did you stop?
She didn't answer. Not really.
Wordert more when you know no one will listen.
He looked at her then, not with pity, but recognition. Like he'd been there too. Start again, he said simply. Even if no one listens. Especially then. That night, Emily pulled out her old journal. She didn't write about the pain directly. Instead, she wrote a story about a girl made of smoke who learned how to become solid. It was raw, uneven, but it was hers. Spring came slowly, as if reluctant to push the cold aside. Trees began to bloom. Emily's schedule softened. She dropped one of her part-time jobs, started a creative writing elective, and even read one of her short stories aloud in class. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Marcus became a constant, never overbearing, always present. They weren't a couple in the traditional sense. No labels.
No promise.
Just two people who met in the quiet and stayed there together. In April, her mother called. It was the first call since she'd left for Chicago. Emily stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she did. "Emily," her mother said. "We need to talk." The tone was clipped, transactional. Her stomach tightened. "We're dealing with your grandfather's land. He left a portion in your name, but your father wants to consolidate everything under Josh. It's cleaner. We just need your signature on a waiver. It doesn't really change anything. You wouldn't have moved back anyway." Emily was silent. Her mother continued, "I'll email you the paperwork. You can just sign and send it back. It's the logical thing to do." "I'll think about it," Emily replied, her voice flat. "Don't make this difficult, Emily. It's just a technicality." But it wasn't. Not to her. That night, she told Marcus. "They want me to give up my share of the land," she said.
The land my grandfather gave me.
"Just so Josh can have it all." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to sign it. Avoid the drama. But another part," she hesitated. "Another part is tired of being erased." He nodded. "Then don't let them erase you. Not again." Emily didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling, the glow from the streetlight outside tracing lines across her blanket. In the morning, she opened her laptop and wrote an email to her mother. "I won't sign. I deserve to be acknowledged, even if you don't think I do. I won't disappear so someone else can shine." She hit send. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't feel fear. She felt something close to power. When she told Marcus, he smiled. "You didn't escape Kentucky just to replicate it here," he said. "You came to become something else." And she was. Piece by piece, day by day, Emily was reclaiming herself, not loudly, not with dramatic declarations, but in the quiet moments where she chose herself again and again. She had escaped Kentucky. Now she was beginning to build a home, inside her own voice. By the start of her second year, Emily had settled into a rhythm. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was hers. She juggled her classes, part-time job at the bakery, and weekend shifts at the library with the precision of someone who knew that a single misstep, one missed deadline, one failed exam, one unpaid bill, could knock the whole structure down. She lived frugally, bought groceries in bulk, thrifted clothes, never went out unless it was free or necessary. She had learned to live with hunger, not just physical, but emotional. She was hungry for validation, for peace, for a version of herself that didn't constantly feel like she had to prove her right to exist. Chicago was not kind, but it was honest. No one pretended to care unless they truly did. That, oddly, comforted her. The city didn't ask for performance.
It simply demanded persévérance.
There were nights when exhaustion pressed on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. On those nights, she would return from her shift at the bakery with flour in her hair and the ache of standing for hours still ringing in her legs. She would peel off her shoes, eat a cup of instant noodles in silence, and stare out the window at the city lights. In those moments, she felt like both survivor and ghost. It was during one of those nights that her laptop buzzed with a new email. Subject: writing submission, accepted. She blinked. A few weeks prior, on a dare from Marcus, she had submitted a personal essay to a small online literary journal. The piece was about growing up in silence, about learning to speak not with volume but with clarity. She hadn't expected to hear back. But there it was, a short message from the editor: "We'd love to publish your story. Your voice carries weight." Emily stared at the screen for a long time before reading the email again. And again. And again. She didn't tell anyone for 3 days. Not because she wasn't proud, she was, but because some part of her still believed good things could be taken away if she spoke them aloud. Eventually, she told Marcus. He grinned and said, "About damn time the world listened." They celebrated with $3 dumplings from a corner place near the train tracks. Emily held the printout of the published story in her hands like a fragile miracle. Her name was there, in bold.
Emily Carter. Note Josh's sister. Note the Kiewan.
Just her. For the first time, she felt real. The essay spread modestly but steadily. A few readers left comments thanking her for her honesty. One woman wrote, "I thought I was the only one who grew up this way."
Emily read the message 10 times.
She wanted to respond, to say, "Me too. I thought I was the only one too." But instead, she simply replied, "You're not." Encouraged, Emily started writing more. Between shifts and classes, she carved out time in the quiet mornings to work on new essays. Some were raw, others more polished, but all of them were true. She began posting them on a personal blog she named The Quiet Edge. It felt right. Like reclaiming a part of herself that had long been dismissed as weakness. Her following grew slowly. A handful of readers turned into hundreds.
Note millions.
Not viral, but real people.
Stranger ou left long, vulnerable comments.
Survivors of emotional neglect. Daughters who had never heard, "I'm proud of you." Sons who were told to man up instead of speak out.
Emily read every word.
Each comment reminded her, pain isolates, but truth connects. Her blog became her refuge. But outside of it, life was still hard. Her student loan debt climbed. Her paychecks barely covered tuition and food. She applied for scholarships she rarely got. She learned to navigate FAFSA like a second language. Her days blurred into each other. Classes, work, study, write, repeat. Sometimes, she wondered if she'd made a mistake choosing this path. If majoring in English was foolish. If all the writing, all the struggle, would ever be enough to build a real life. On one particularly cold night in January, her bank account showed $7.42. Rent was due in 5 days. She sat on her dorm bed, laptop open, staring at the blinking cursor on an unfinished essay. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then dropped to her lap. Her chest tightened. It wasn't the panic of failure, it was the weariness of constant survival. Stephanie, her former roommate, had since moved off campus but still checked in from time to time. That night, she texted, "You good? Haven't seen you post anything in a while." Emily typed, "Just tired."
A moment laté, wanna talk?
She hesitated, then called. They spoke for an hour.
About nothing and everything. About stress, money, loneliness.
About how hard it was to keep trying when it felt like no one cared. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Em," Stephanie said. "Even walls crack eventually." Emily didn't respond right away. Then finally, "But if I stop, what happens? Maybe someone else helps carry the weight." The next morning, Emily swallowed her pride and emailed her advisor asking for emergency financial support. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step. The university responded with a small hardship grant. Enough to buy groceries and keep the lights on.
She criait when the deposit came through.
Not because she was saved, but because she had asked. Asking had always felt like weakness. But maybe she was learning, it was strength. Spring crept in with longer days and occasional sun. Emily's blog reached 1,000 subscribers. She published another essay, this one titled When Your Family Doesn't Come Looking. It was honest, sharp, and deeply personal. The post went semi-viral within niche writing circles. Editors began to reach out. One invited her to write a monthly column on emotional resilience. She said yes. Not because she felt resilient, but because she wanted to become that kind of person. Emily was still scraping by. Her boots still had holes.
Her body stiached.
Her phone screen was still cracked. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer wrote just to survive. She was beginning to write to live. And that changed everything. Emily first met Nora in a writing workshop her junior year. The class met on Wednesday nights in a dimly lit seminar room on the 4th floor of the Humanities building, where the radiator clanked like a ghost and the windows were always fogged. It was the kind of place where stories lingered long after they were read aloud. Nora was a transfer student from Portland, tall and androgynous, with buzzed hair dyed platinum and an arm full of delicate tattoos, tiny birds, broken arrows, a constellation that ran down her wrist like stardust. She wore oversized sweaters and combat boots, and her voice was low, calm, almost musical when she read her work. From the first class, Emily noticed her. Unlike other students who tried too hard to impress or performed their trauma like a badge of honor, Nora's writing was stripped bare. Honest.
Vulnérable without being performative.
Her first piece was a short non-fiction narrative about surviving the foster system. It was brutal, sparse, and so quiet it made the entire room lean in. When she finished reading, there was a full 15 seconds of silence before anyone spoke. Emily waited until after class to approach her. Your piece, she said, voice low, it hit something. Nora looked at her. Thanks. Yours did too. That part about the dinner table and the silence. I've never heard it described that way. That was all it took. They started meeting after class, usually at the 24-hour diner near campus where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber, but the booths were warm and the waitresses let them stay for hours if they tipped well. They'd sit across from each other, laptops open, notebooks splayed, sharing stories they hadn't told anyone else. Emily didn't realize it at first, but she was building something she hadn't dared hope for, a friendship not rooted in obligation or history, but in chosen truth. Nora was the first person outside of Marcus she allowed to read her private work. The raw drafts. The journal entries that bled more than they spoke. And unlike others who responded with praise or pity, Nora responded with questions. What did you mean here? Did you write this for yourself or for someone else? Are you telling the truth, or what you wish was true? Nora pushed her, gently but persistently. And Emily, for the first time, welcomed the push. They became something of a pair, known around the workshop as the quiet ones who write the loudest things. Other students started asking their opinions on drafts, but Emily never gave advice easily. She knew what it felt like to have your story misunderstood. To be told how to rewrite your own pain into something more palatable. With Nora, there was none of that. There was only trust, earned line by line. One night in March, they sat on the roof of Nora's apartment building, bundled in jackets, their breath curling in the cold spring air.
Below, the city pulsed with life. Car son king, l'octaire spilling out of bar, distant sirens echoing against the irises.
Above, the sky was a murky black, stars swallowed by light pollution.
Do you ever wish you could go back?
Nora asked, tossing a pebble over the edge.
Not to change anything.
Just to see it all again from the outside. Emily thought for a long moment. No, she said. I think I'd want to scream at myself. Tell her to run faster. To stop trying so hard to be seen. Nora nodded.
You said to wish you had a different past.
Now I just wish I had someone like me when I was younger.
The word landed hard.
Emily didn't say it, but in her mind, she thought, me too. After that night, Emily began drafting a longer piece, something different.
Not a blog post. Not a workshop submission. A mémoire fragment.
It had no title yet, only working phrases and bits of dialogue that she whispered to herself on the walk to campus. She wrote about her childhood, but not as a victim. She wrote as an observer. She described the kitchen tiles under her bare feet, the sound of her father's boots on the porch, the way her mother always stirred soup counterclockwise. Details she had once tried to forget now emerged as anchors. She wasn't documenting pain, she was reclaiming it. She shared the first chapter with Nora, heart pounding. Nora read it twice before speaking. You know this isn't just good, right? This is important.
Emily shook her head.
It's just my story. Exactly. And it matters. Not because it's dramatic or unique, but because it's honest. And because someone out there is living something similar and thinks they're alone. The next day, Emily emailed the draft to one of the editors she had connected with through her blog. She didn't expect anything to come from it. But a week later, she received a reply. There's something here. Let's talk. They scheduled a call. Emily wore her nicest sweater and tried not to let her voice shake. The editor, Elena, was kind, direct, and passionate. She talked about underrepresented voices, about trauma narratives written by survivors instead of observers. She didn't promise a book deal, but she offered mentorship, guidance, support. It was more than Emily had dared to imagine. Later that evening, she called Marcus. I think I'm writing a book, she said, barely believing the words.
Marcus Logued.
Of course you are. You've been writing it since the day you left Kentucky. She smiled. The next few weeks blurred. Between classes, writing, work, and revisions, Emily hardly slept. But she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was chasing something.
Something real. One night, she walked home alone through the Quai Campus Street.
The trees were beginning to bud. Spring had arrived.
A soft breeze rustled the leaves.
For once, she wasn't thinking about bills or deadlines. She was thinking about her voice. How it had once been small, buried, almost erased. And now, it filled pages. As she crossed the intersection by the bookstore, she saw her reflection in the glass. Not a ghost.
Not a shadow. A woman.
With a pen in her hand.
And a future unfolding, word by word.
It was a Wednesday afternoon when Emily's phone rang with a Kentucky area code. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering, her breath catching just slightly. The name on the display said Mom, though Emily couldn't remember the last time she had seen it. They're not attached to a missed call or a voicemail she never listened to. She didn't answer right away. She let it ring out, then sat in silence, the sound of the city muffled behind her apartment's window glass.
The call left no message.
3 hours later, the phone rang again. Same number. This time, she answered. Hello. There was a pause, then her mother's voice, sharp as ever, but thinner than she remembered. Emily. I didn't think you'd pick up. Emily sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea she hadn't touched. I wasn't going to, she said, then immediately regretted the bluntness.
Her mother sighed.
I won't take much of your time.
Silence.
Emily waited. It's about the land. Your grandfather's. There's been some confusion with the paperwork. Josh is trying to get everything sorted, but one of the parcels is still in your name. The one off 219, with the small pond. Emily remembered the pond. She'd once fallen in it trying to catch a frog. Her grandfather had pulled her out and given her a blanket that smelled like smoke and cedar. He'd been one of the few people in the family who saw her, who asked her questions and waited for answers. You want me to sign it over, Emily said, flatly. Yes, her mother replied, without hesitation. It's easier if it's all in one name. Josh is planning to build on it, expand the property. It would be complicated to split. Why now? Emily asked. That land's been sitting there for years. Her mother hesitated. Josh is getting married. They want to build a house.
Start fresh.
Of course.
A house for Josh. A life, a legacy, a fresh start. One more structure built on the key dismantling of Emily's place in the family.
I'll think about it, Emily said, her voice cool.
Her mother exhaled like someone closing a door.
It's not a big deal. It's just a formality. Not to me. The line went quiet, then clicked off. Emily sat at the table long after the call ended. The tea had gone cold. She didn't cry. She didn't pace. She just sat there, the familiar ache rising in her chest, not of loss but of repetition. This wasn't new. This was the same pattern, wearing a new coat. She thought of the pond. Of the way her grandfather used to teach her to skip stones. Of how he once told her, land is memory.
Don't give away what you still remember.
Later that evening, she told Nora. They want me to vanish again, she said. In writing this time. Nora looked at her, calm as always. What are you going to do?
I don't know.
Nora tilted her head. I think you do. Emily nodded slowly. She did. She wasn't that girl anymore. The one who signed forms without asking. Who bent to keep peace in a war she didn't start. The next day, she drafted an email. Subject, regarding the land.
I won't be signing anything. I understand its inconvenients.
But I've been erased enough times already. This piece of land, however small, is mine. It's not about the property. It's about the principle. I am not a footnote in this family. Not anymore. She reread it once, twice, then hit send.
No réponse calme. Not for days.
But that silence, for the first time, felt like her own. In the days that followed, Emily found herself rereading old drafts. Pieces she had written in the first year of college, full of hesitation and coded language. She saw how much she had censored herself. Softened the edges. Protected people who never protected her. She began rewriting them. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. She wrote one new piece called Inheritance. It wasn't about the land. Not really. It was about emotional inheritance. About what we carry when no one offers to carry us. About what we leave behind not in property, but in memory. She sent the draft to Elena, her editor. Elena replied within an hour. This is your best work yet. Let's run it as a featured piece. It was published a week later. The response was overwhelming. Emails. Comments. Messages from women in their 30s, men in their 50s, students, single parents. They all said the same thing in different words. I know this feeling. The piece was shared across platforms. One well-known therapist reposted it with the caption, "This is what unspoken grief looks like."
Emily read every comment.
Every word. Not for validation, but for connection. Because suddenly, her story wasn't just hers anymore. One night, she received an anonymous message through her blog. I read your piece about the land. My brother took everything when our dad died. I didn't fight it. I still regret that. Thank you for fighting. Emily replied simply, you're not too late to be heard. It wasn't about the land. It never had been. It was about the idea that someone, anyone, could ask her to vanish, and expect her to say yes. She met with Marcus that weekend. They hadn't seen each other in a few months, but when she walked into the cafe and saw him sitting by the window with his usual tea, the world snapped back into place for a moment. He stood, hugged her, then pulled out a chair. I read the piece, he said, eyes warm.
You did it.
She smiled. I said no. I know. And it was loud. They talked for hours. About writing, about resistance, about how sometimes the only revolution you need is to simply exist on your own terms. When she got home that night, there was another email from her mother. Short. Cold. Disappointed. We thought you'd be more reasonable. Josh is hurt. Emily stared at it, then deleted it without replying.
Some silence don't need to be broken.
She curled up on her couch, laptop in her lap, and opened a blank document. Title, No is a sentence. She began to type, the keys clicking with a rhythm that felt like reclamation. This time, she wouldn't explain. This time, she wouldn't soften. This time, she would write herself fully, unapologetic, unerased. Because sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is to simply refuse to disappear. The essay Inheritance marked a turning point, not just for Emily's readers, but for Emily herself. What began as an act of self-protection became something larger, a quiet call to others who had once been silenced. Her inbox filled daily with letters from strangers. Some were short, simple thank you notes from readers who found pieces of themselves in her words. Others came long and winding, personal confessions from people who had never spoken their truths aloud before. There were messages from women who had given up inheritances to maintain family peace, men who were never told it was okay to grieve, queer youth pushed to the margins, and eldest daughters who bore burdens they never chose. Emily read them all. Slowly, reverently. She replied when she could, never with answers, only with acknowledgement. She understood now what she hadn't back then. Her voice didn't have to be loud to be heard. It only had to be true. Encouraged by the response, Emily poured herself into her blog, The Quiet Edge, with new energy. She redesigned the site, gave it a cleaner look, and started organizing her essays into themes: memory, boundaries, forgiveness, silence. She added a small section titled Letters Unsent, inviting readers to submit the letters they had written but never sent. It was a simple idea. But within weeks, hundreds had arrived. One woman wrote a letter to her father who had never said, "I love you." A man wrote to a sister he hadn't spoken to since their mother's funeral. A college student wrote to a best friend who disappeared after she came out. Emily posted each one anonymously, line edited only for clarity, never tone. The section grew into a living archive of human ache, of broken ties, unspoken apologies, and the small, sharp griefs that collect in the corners of our lives. Readers didn't just submit letters, they read others with the care of people who understood what it meant to carry the unsaid. Her site traffic multiplied. A therapist in San Francisco shared The Quiet Edge with her clients. A podcast host in New York invited Emily to speak. An editor at a major online magazine requested permission to republish several of her essays under a column called Soft Resistance. Emily agreed, but under one condition: the words had to stay intact. No editing for tone. No briqueterre ending. The pain had to stay visible. She wasn't writing for pity. She was writing for the people who needed to know they weren't alone. Still, with growth came uncertainty. Emily often asked herself if she was doing the right thing. Was she re-traumatizing herself, reopening wounds she had only just begun to close? Was she, in telling her story again and again, giving too much of herself away? One evening, overwhelmed by it all, she called Nora. "Am I making it worse?" Emily asked. "I mean for myself. For them. For everyone reading." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you're letting people know their pain isn't imaginary. That it's allowed to exist. That's not making it worse. That's making it bearable." Emily let that sink in. I didn't mean to become this," she whispered. "What verdicis?" "You didn't mean to survive either," Nora replied. "But here you are." Around that same time, her professor from the writing workshop, Dr. Levinson, reached out with a proposition. "We're organizing a campus-wide event on mental health and creative expression. Would you consider speaking?" Emily hesitated. "I'm not a speaker. I'm a writer." Levinson smiled over the Zoom call. "Then speak like a writer. C'est what est true." Against her instinct to hide, she said yes. The event took place on a rainy April evening in the university auditorium. The crowd wasn't enormous, but it was larger than she'd expected. Students, faculty, even some local community members filled the seats. Marcus Cam. Nora sat in the front row, arms crossed, eyes steady. Emily took the stage with her notes tucked inside a leather-bound notebook, her grandfather's, which she had found at the back of a closet during her last visit home. She hadn't brought it for drama. She brought it because it reminded her that someone once had believed in her voice before she did. She started slowly, her voice soft, then steadier. "I grew up in a house where silence was safer than speaking. Where invisibility wasn't punishment, it was survival. For years, I thought if I stayed small, quiet, good, maybe I'd be loved. I wasn't." A hush fell over the room. "But I learned something else," she continued. "That writing for me was not just escape. It was rebellion. It was how I told the truth when no one was listening. And the truth is, there are so many of us who were not seen. Who were told we were too sensitive, too emotional, too much, or not enough." She paused. Looked out at the crowd. "But we are still here. And we are not too anything. We are just human. And our stories deserve space." Applause came slowly, then grew. Not thunderous, but sustained. Sincere. After the event, students lined up to speak with her. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to say thank you. One girl, maybe 19, clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I brought this," she said shyly. "It's a letter I wrote to my mom. I didn't know where to send it. But I saw your letters unsent section." Emily took it gently.
It belonged there.
Thank you for sharing it with me. That night, as she walked home through the misty air, past lamplights and puddles reflecting broken city light, Emily felt something unfamiliar blooming inside her. Not joy exactly, but peace. She had spent so much of her life shrinking, making herself smaller to survive. Now for the first time she was expanding, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that claimed space. Authentically, quietly, completely. She returned to her apartment, lit a candle by her desk, and opened her laptop. New post draft. Title: The Power of Being Heard. She typed, "We don't speak just to be answered. We speak to know we exist. And when someone listens, really listens, we begin to belong to ourselves again." She paused, hands still on the keys, and smiled. She wasn't writing to prove anything anymore. She was writing to remember. And in doing so, she was helping others remember too. The invitation arrived in early June, tucked into a pale blue envelope with embossed cursive and a Kentucky return address. Emily knew what it was before opening it. She held it in her hand for a full hour before tearing it open.
Joshua Carter and Olivia James. Request the honor of your presence.
At their wedding celebration. Saturday, the 14th of July. Carter family property, Owensville, KY. No mention of Emily, our sister or the bride's future sister-in-law. No note from her mother or father. Just the generic message, addressed to Ms. Emily Carter, with a small RSVP card tucked neatly inside. It wasn't a request for reconciliation. It was a performance of inclusion, a pretense of family unity, one last ask to play her old role, silent and smiling, in the background of someone else's story. She stared at the invitation on her desk. Part of her wanted to toss it into the trash and never look back. But another part, the part she had cultivated through years of writing, of healing, felt something else. Not rage. Not even sorrow.
Just ridine.
She would go. Not for them. But for herself. Not to forgive or be forgiven, but to bear witness to the life she'd left behind, and to say without words, "I no longer belong here, and that is my victory." The drive to Owensville was long and hot, the Kentucky summer thick with humidity and the smell of roadside grass. Emily rented a modest sedan and drove alone, her playlist alternating between old jazz and spoken-word poetry. She stopped once for gas and once more at a rest stop where she scribbled a few lines into her notebook. Coming home is like reading an old letter in a language you no longer speak.
Familiar.
But strange. When she reached the outskirts of town, the memories came fast. The schoolyard fence where she used to sit alone at recess, the grocery store where she'd bagged groceries on weekends, the library where she'd once spent entire afternoons pretending to study just to escape the noise of home. The Carter property was still large and well kept. The pond glimmered under the sunlight, surrounded now by trimmed hedges and new gravel paths. A white tent had been set up behind the house, with rows of white chairs facing a small wooden arch wrapped in lilies and eucalyptus. She parked at the edge of the gravel driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, watching guests in pastel dresses and tailored suits filter in. Laughter carried across the lawn, easy and warm. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her simple navy dress.
Nothing too loud. Nothing too soft.
Just her. A few people nodded politely as she passed. A couple of older relatives squinted, then offered hesitant greetings.
No one together.
No one rushed to her side. She wasn't surprised. She saw her mother first, near the tent, giving orders to the caterers, clipboard in hand. She looked almost exactly the same, only older. More tired. Her hair was grayer, but her posture was still stiff with purpose. Emily approached slowly. Helen Carter looked up and froze. "Emily," she said, voice neutral. "Mom. You came." "I did." There was a pause. Long enough for both of them to feel the weight of everything not said. "You look well," her mother offered, in the way one might compliment the weather. "Thanks." They stood in silence. Then Helen glanced down at her clipboard. "Well, the ceremony starts soon.
You can sit wherever you like.
Families in the front 2 rows." Emily didn't move. "I'll find my place," she said. She walked toward the back. Inside the tent, the ceremony was already beginning. Emily sat in the last row, just close enough to hear the vows but far enough to be forgettable in the photographs. She watched as Josh stood at the altar, grinning, holding Olivia's hands. The same Josh who had once laughed when their parents made her take the fall for his mistakes. The same Josh who had never called, never written, never asked. And yet, here he was, center stage, radiant in his ease. Emily watched him closely, not with bitterness, but with the quiet clarity of distance. As the officiant spoke about love, family, and legacy, Emily looked around. Guests smiled. Her parents sat in the front row proud. None of them glanced back. And for the first time in her life, Emily was grateful for their indifference. Because it gave her permission to leave. She didn't wait for the reception. She slipped away as the guests clapped and the couple walked down the aisle. She took one last look at the house, the land, the pond. The place that had shaped her, hurt her, taught her silence. Then she walked back to her car and drove. She didn't cry. She didn't turn the music on. She just drove, her fingers steady on the wheel, her breathing calm. Back in her Chicago apartment that night, she lit a candle and opened her laptop. The screen glowed softly as she opened a new document. Title, I Went Home, and No One Noticed. She wrote, "There is a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need confrontation or closure. It just needs presence. To return to the place that broke you. And realize you are no longer breakable." The words flowed easily, not like an essay, not like a confession, like a truth that had waited its turn. She posted it without editing. Within an hour, it was shared hundreds of times. The comments poured in. "Thank you for this. I went home and realized I wasn't invisible anymore, I was free. You gave language to something I've felt my whole life. Maybe we don't need to be invited back. Maybe we just need to know we can leave." Emily read every comment, heart full, not with pride, but with peace. She closed her laptop and walked to the window.
The city lights blinked below.
She didn't know what came next. But she knew this. She had returned. She had left. And she had survived not by being welcomed, but by walking away. Not every story needed a happy ending. Some just needed an honest exit. The summer after the wedding passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. Emily worked from her apartment most days, writing freelance essays and editing her manuscript chapter by chapter. The blog continued to grow, more readers, more letters, more voices rising from the long silence of their lives. But for once, Emily didn't feel rushed by the momentum. She didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She wrote because she wanted to. She edited because she cared. And she rested because she had earned it. In late August, an email arrived that made her sit back in her chair and read it twice. "Emily, I've followed your work for some time now. Your essays have deeply resonated with our community. I'm writing to invite you to speak at our fall conference in Boston, Voices Forward, Healing Through Story. Your presence and your voice would be an honor." It was signed by Dr. Camille Rhodes, a psychologist and researcher known for her work on narrative therapy and intergenerational trauma. Emily had cited her papers once in a class presentation, never imagining that Camille would ever know her name. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. The conference was held in a sleek glass-paneled building in downtown Boston, overlooking the Charles River. When Emily stepped into the auditorium, she was momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of it: rows of chairs, large screens, cameras, microphones. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. But as she walked through the space, she remembered every moment she had once thought she'd vanish, every time she'd sat at a dinner table, afraid to speak, every night she'd cried alone in a dorm room, wondering if her life would ever mean something beyond survival. And now she was here. On the second day of the conference, she stepped onto the stage in a navy blazer and black slacks, simple, clean, powerful. She stood behind the podium, adjusted the mic, and looked out at the crowd. Then she began. "I used to believe silence was my inheritance. That I was born to be the background to someone else's story. That love was something I had to earn by disappearing." She paused, letting the words settle. "But writing taught me something different. Writing gave me permission, not to be loud, but to be whole. And through telling my story, I found hundreds, thousands, of people who were living different versions of the same silence." She talked about the quiet edge, about the letters, about the people who wrote not to be fixed, but to be found. She ended with a sentence that came to her in the early morning light a week before the conference. "Stories don't save us from pain. But they remind us that pain is not a sentence, we are not stuck in it. We move through it. We make meaning from it. We become. The room stood in ovation. Not explosive, but reverent. Like everyone there had understood something they hadn't known they needed to hear. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her. One young woman, maybe 23, with short hair and shaking hands, stepped forward. "I haven't talked to my parents in 3 years," she said. "They still think I'm broken. But when I read your piece about walking away, I realized maybe I don't have to wait for them to understand me. Maybe I just need to understand myself." Emily nodded. "You're not broken," she said.
You're rebuilding.
The woman cried, and Emily held her hand until the trembling stopped. When she returned to Chicago, there were 2 new messages waiting in her inbox. One was from a small but respected publishing house, asking if she was open to turning her blog and essays into a book. The other was from her former professor, Dr. Levinson, now curating a special issue of a literary journal on healing through memoir. Both messages used the same word, voice. It was a word Emily once feared didn't belong to her. Now, it was the center of her life. She accepted both opportunities. She spent her days writing, revising, and meeting with editors. She walked along Lake Michigan in the evenings, notebook in hand, capturing moments of quiet that felt like sunlight pressing into her skin. Sometimes Marcus called. Sometimes Nora dropped by with pastries and new tattoos. Their lives were busy, always moving, but the connection remained. One Sunday morning, she found herself at a small independent bookstore in Wicker Park, invited to speak on a panel of young writers. The audience was mostly students and early career creatives. When asked what advice she would give to someone starting to write their story, Emily answered without hesitation. "Don't wait to be ready. You won't ever be. Just start. Write like no one will read it. And then one day, if you're lucky, you'll find that someone already has." The host asked her what had changed the most for her since her first blog post. She smiled. "Back then, I thought writing was about being seen. Now I know, it's about seeing myself, others,
The truth in between."
Later, someone in the audience came up and asked, "How do you know when you're healed?" Emily looked at them carefully. Then said, "I don't know that you ever fully are. But I do know this, you reach a point where the pain doesn't make the rules anymore."
Where you stand in the sun and release, I built this light myself. That is close enough.
That night, Emily walked home alone, city lights glinting off rain-damp streets. Her keys jingled in her coat pocket, her shoes clicking rhythmically on the pavement. At a stoplight, she paused and glanced at her reflection in a storefront window. She didn't see the girl from Kentucky anymore.
She saw a woman. Still learning. Still growing.
But standing. And that, after everything, was everything. Autumn in Chicago arrived like a quiet gift. The city softened. Leaves curled gold and copper along the sidewalks, the wind became crisper, and the sky held a gentler kind of blue. Emily spent her mornings wrapped in an old sweater, her favorite mug in hand, editing the final chapters of her manuscript beside the window of her apartment. The book had a title now, The Quiet Edge. It wasn't just the name of the blog anymore, it had become something else, something truer. A declaration. A promise. A home. The publisher planned to release it the following spring. The process had been both exhilarating and exhausting: edits, interviews, deadlines, approvals. But through it all, Emily held to the same quiet compass she had followed from the beginning.
Tell the truth.
Even when it's soft. Especially then. She no longer feared her past. She no longer flinched when people asked about home. She had learned how to answer without apology. It was difficult. It taught me how to leave. Still, there were moments when the old ache stirred. Not loudly. Just enough. One October morning, Emily found herself scrolling through the submissions inbox for The Quiet Edge. She still received dozens of letters each week. She didn't post all of them, but she read every single one. She treated them like artifacts, sacred in their honesty, their trembling sentences and their brave punctuation. One letter that morning caught her attention. It began plainly.
Dear Doctor,
I know you may never read this. I don't even know how to begin. But I've read your blog. I think I see myself in the mother who never said enough, never listened enough. I'm sorry for whoever I failed. It wasn't signed. There was no way to know if it came from her own mother or a stranger.
But the letter shook something loose inside Emily.
Not guilt. Not pity. Just a quiet understanding. Someone somewhere wished they had done better. She spent the rest of the day restless. She walked through Lincoln Park under trees shedding themselves. She bought a coffee and let it go cold. And then at dusk, she sat at her desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and wrote a letter she had once sworn she never would. Not for them. For her. Dear Mom. I used to think that silence between us meant I had failed. That if I had been easier, quieter, more obedient, maybe you would have loved me the way you loved Josh. Maybe you would have asked me how I was instead of what I got on a test. Maybe you would have hugged me when I cried instead of telling me to stop being dramatic. For a long time, I hated you for it. Quietly. Completely. I carried that weight into every classroom, every friendship, every job. I let it whisper to me that I was unworthy, that I had to earn care, prove my usefulness to deserve love. But now I see something else. I see that you were raised in silence too. That maybe no one asked you how you were, either. That maybe you thought love meant managing, not nurturing. That maybe you gave what you had. It doesn't excuse it. But it explains it. And that's enough for me now. I'm not writing to forgive. I'm writing to release. Because I'm tired of carrying a story that doesn't end with me. I'm building a new one. One where love isn't bartered for performance. Where I don't disappear to make others comfortable. Where my voice isn't too much, it's just enough. You don't have to read this. You don't even have to change. I just needed to say, I'm not waiting for you to choose me anymore. Because I've already chosen myself. And she is enough. Emily. She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the back of her journal. Not to send. But to know it had been written. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in weeks.
In the morning, she woke to sunlight spilling across the floor.
The kind of light that felt like forgiveness, not from others, but from within. Later that week, she returned to the bookstore in Wicker Park for a reading event. This time, she was the headliner. The store was full. Readers, young writers, quiet girls who reminded her of herself. She stood at the podium and read an excerpt from the new book. The passage was simple, a memory of sitting alone in a kitchen, holding a drawing no one cared to look at. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, someone stood. Then another. Applause, not wild but full. Earnest. Like breath held too long finally being released. Afterward, people came to speak with her. A teenager said, "Your story made me feel less alone." A father said, "I'm going to talk to my daughter differently now." A woman whispered, "I didn't know it was okay to say no until I read your blog." Emily listened to them all. She didn't try to be wise. She just let them speak. And in each story, she saw how one voice could ripple into another. Not loudly. Just enough. That night, as she walked home through streets dappled with fallen leaves, Emily thought about the girl she had once been, the one who hid in the back of classrooms, who wrote poems in secret, who signed away a piece of land because she thought her voice didn't matter. She wished she could reach back and whisper to that girl. One day you will speak, and people will hear you. One day, your words will make space for others. One day your silence will end, and in its place there will be a garden. She smiled, let the thought go, and stepped forward. Into the life she had built. Into the story she had written. Into the light she had learned to carry.